This is a moment of much more open historical moment, if you like. It's, yep, business as usual for the empire continues. US strategic concerns of maintaining some sort of global dominance remains. But the Trumpian phenomenon should not be underrated at the same time.
Richard Sakwa, welcome to the Burning Archive.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's a great honor for me. You're one of the world's leading experts on Russia, Western relations, and also I guess, the situation in Ukraine. And you've just published a book, The Culture of the Second Cold War, which we'll talk about shortly. But I wonder if, just to start off the interview, given it's the 11th of March, 2025. I believe Marco Rubio might have been flying to Riyadh or been meeting with
The meeting
Ukrainian.
is today,
Yeah.
yes.
Um, and there's a lot of debate all around the world about is this a genuine opportunity for peace? What's emerging between Russia and the United States, or is it, just some people argue it's just business as usual for the empire sort of thing. I'd be really interested in your viewpoint as to what your assessment of the, I guess, prospects for a genuine peace are in the current moment.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. This is a moment of much more open historical moment, if you like to put it, or I like to put it this way. It's, yep, business as usual for the empire continues. US strategic concerns of maintaining some sort of global dominance remains. But the Trumpian phenomenon should not be underrated at the same time, because I mean, there's all sorts of elements involved. I'll come back to the Ukraine aspect in a
Mm,
second, but just simply to say that uh, Trump clearly is a major repudiation of the classic form of hegemonic internationalism that the United States has practiced since the end of the Second World War. Incidentally, this year is the 80th anniversary of the Second World War,
mm,
the creation in 1945 of the United Nations of the Charter International System, which the United States obviously was one of the main sponsors of that, along with China, the Soviet Union, and others. But so he's repudiating in many ways the foundations of the post-war international order, which, of course, was a peculiar balance of the US-led, what we then like later to call the rules-based system or
mm,
order, and of course that charter internationalism, and constantly in tension. And Trump is simply repudiating that tension and simply saying we go it alone, but which also changes the character of US dominance. And so he's shifting away from this, what hegemonic internationalism, and what we like to have, that
mm,
more independent sovereign internationalism based on charter sovereignty of states, non-interference, etc.
mm,
At the same time, he is recasting globalism. And of course, the United States has been at the center of a whole global network and a vision of globalism, which, after the end of the First Cold War in 1989, meant that basically the US vision of modernity was considered the only viable one. I mean, Fukuyama, end of history, all of that.
mm,
And the vision that Russia, China would join the so-called rules-based order, the US-led rules-based order, as not necessarily subalterns, but certainly part of a system which they would have to fit. Well, yeah, perhaps a subaltern, maybe that is the best word. But, oh, and of course, to their benefit, but at the same time, politically difficult, both for China, 5,000-year history of sovereignty, etc. Russia, of course, a proud nation state, and not a defeated one, despite
mm,
what people say about the Cold
mm.
War itself. It was undefeated, not so therefore it joined not like Germany and Japan after 1945. Just one other thing there before we get to Ukraine. Of course, this is the 40th anniversary of Gorbachev, Mikhail Sergeyevich, coming to power in the Soviet Union. He came to power
Indeed.
in
True.
March 1985. I know we remember that. A time of great hope. a
Yes.
vision that we could move from the negative peace, which had dominated the 40 years before that, 45 to 85, and that we could, and later he developed this idea of a positive peace order.
Mm,
In Europe, it would be the common European home. Globally, a vision, as outlined in his magnificent speech
mm,
to the United Nations in December 1988, of work of states working together, of different types of social order, communist, capitalist, more statist, more
mm,
market oriented, large and small, working together. So it's a powerful vision. 80 years ago, 40 years ago,
mm,
what Trump is doing is throwing out that bathwater, if you like, of well, he's throwing out the bathwater of old-fashioned hegemonic globalism with a
mm,
baby of charter internationalism, Soviet UN based. But what is he's recasting globalism, in which it's much more brutish, power dominated. But at the same time, paradoxically, it recognizes the interests of Russia, for example. Some would argue simply instrumentally to try to pull it away from alignment with China. But nevertheless, perhaps even recognizing China's got its own interests. So, despite his brutal application of tariff policy, trade policy, and so on, even against allies, let alone against
mm, mm,
potential adversaries. So, that's the context, I think. I mean, an
mm,
absolute game changer, which of course has alarmed the European powers, because basically Trump coming to Ukraine says, I don't want to own this war. It's not our war. It's Biden's war. And it wouldn't have happened if it were for, and he's right. It would
mm,
not have happened if Trump had been elected in 2020. And he does want to put an end to it. And so I certainly welcome negotiations. Who knows how they're going to end? At
mm,
least I mean, any journey, you're not going to get anywhere if you don't start the journey. If you just sit at
mm,
home lamenting, oh dear, how awful the world is. So I welcome that, of course. And in fact, it is very interesting. Marco Rubio himself, of course, I mean, some people in Washington say he won't last more than 18 months. I actually think well, compared to Blinken and Sullivan, the
mm,
predecessors in the Biden administration, he's been very eloquent, very forceful. Famous interview of Megyn Kelly a couple of weeks back, in which he said, "Look, yes, the world is multipolar. We can't stick to this unipolar vision." And it's
mm,
in that context, I think, that he is intent on putting an end to a war, which was one of the most avoidable and wars in history. And it was clearly provoked by NATO enlargement, as both Rubio and Trump himself have admitted, finally,
mm,
that it was a security concern. It's not, the war is not about well, maybe it's become that, but it's certainly not about Russia's imperial trying to reconstitute the Soviet Union. So, yes, a great historical moment, very exciting, but it's going to be a bumpy ride, I can tell you.
yes, indeed, indeed. I mean, it's interesting thinking about the comparison with Gorbachev because I guess, some people might say, well, if Gorbachev was unable to achieve a positive peace, how will Donald Trump? But perhaps Donald Trump has a more willing set of partners around the world than perhaps Mikhail Gorbachev met with George H.W. Bush in the late 1980s or early 1990s, maybe.
Absolutely. It takes a Trump, perhaps, to do what a
Yes.
smooth operator could not. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I just ask one quick follow-up question with that? Because I've heard some people talk about a return to great power politics and spheres of influence, but I think I saw you do an interview. It might have been with the Russian ambassador in Britain, where you said we don't really want spheres of influence. We want spheres of security in this sort of new international order. Did you want to maybe just explain that
Yeah.
concept a little bit?
Yes, because a lot of people talk. Yeah, you're absolutely right. They're talking about a return to great power politics. In other words, 19th century
Mm,
great power politics, which I don't think that's a good model. A concert of powers. Of course, it's better than the the hegemonic globalism that has been exercised by the US for so long, which, yes, it's delivered many public goods, but it's also been, 54 US military interventions during the First Cold War, ill-fated, disastrous wars ever since,
mm,
Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and more bombing of Serbia, etc. So
mm,
quite clearly, that's not a good way. So I think so. Yes, great powers exist, but because I'm a great partisan of this Charter International
mm,
System, the 1945 system. It's not a Yalta-Potsdam system. Russians like to call it Yalta-Potsdam. That was not a system. That was a specific arrangement for Europe at the end of the war between
mm,
the great powers. Sure, it wasn't particularly great for Poland, but on the other hand, it allowed Poland to develop as within new borders, which was
mm,
first time possibly in history.
mm,
Um, but that anyway, Yalta Potsdam is not an international system. It's a charter. And today there are 193 states. We've also provided a framework for decolonization.
mm,
And now these states, none of them, large, small, or medium, is willing to trade its sovereignty, except Ukraine and others who are very much within the US ambit. So yeah, therefore, spheres of influence. Of course, within that, it just makes sense to focus on security. And therefore, of course, just like Kennedy in October 1962 was not going to
mm,
allow Soviet missiles in Cuba 90 miles off the Florida coast.
mm,
Equally, we can't have Aegis ashore missile emplacements in Ukraine, which can fire Tomahawk missiles, which can be nuclear tipped. I mean,
mm.
this
Yes.
is what I mean. And
Yeah.
for example, I often use this example, great country, Republic of Ireland, and
Mm,
it's neutral, and quite rightly so, and sensibly so. But of course, if the Chinese wanted to build a military emplacement in Ireland, I think the British would have something to say about it, and quite rightly so. That's what I mean by security. That,
mm,
and this is the fundamental principle of Helsinki,
mm,
the Helsinki Final Act of August 1975, the Paris Charter of November 1990, Istanbul document of 1999, and Astana of 2010. Those are the four key ones. Sorry to
mm.
list them so
Yeah.
pedantically,
Yeah.
but
Ab-
those are
Yep.
ones. All four of them stress the indivisibility of security, while at the same time talking about free choice.
Mm,
But that free choice, in my view, is they're not opposites. Free choice would be a responsible power, would exercise its free choice while understanding that security has to be indivisible, if you see what I
yeah.
mean.
Yeah.
And that's
Yep.
what we failed to do dramatically
Yeah.
after 1989.
Absolutely, which is very much the subject of your book, The Lost Peace, which people can see there.
Yeah.
But we want to talk today about your new book, The Culture of the Second Cold War. And you say in that book that the center of the book is a puzzle about how we got embroiled in a second Cold War, with some, deep sadness and regret. Like me, you remember those days of hope with Gorbachev, etc. What's your overall answer as to how we did
Mm.
get embroiled in a second Cold War?
Yeah. I think there's obviously complicated, but bottom line, I think it is the fact that after 1989, and even during Perestroika, you mentioned George H.W.
Mm,
Bush and his successors, basically they misinterpreted the end. They thought that the Soviet Union basically capitulated to the greater economic and ideological power of what I call the
mm,
political West. This
mm,
is a military, industrial, media combinat established during the First Cold War, which instead of being dismantled at the end of it just served its purpose. NATO, thank you very much, goodbye.
mm,
Instead of which of course, peculiar. This is going back to Trump. He's now asking the questions that should have been asked 30 years ago.
mm,
How do we establish a more secure system for all concerned across from Lisbon to Vladivostok and more and globally?
mm,
So, but the worst thing is, after the end of the First Cold War, this political West not only didn't uh, dissolve, it actually radicalized in all sorts
mm,
of ways. It claimed to be universal. It then more and more substituted for the United Nations, hence the term. Rules-based order is a substitution. What should be charter-based international law and so on, and that genuine multilateralism working through, bodies which now Trump wants to leave, the World Health
mm,
Organization, for example, and many, many more. So it's substituted. The US-led order, the political West, claimed to be synonymous with the world order itself, and that
mm,
was a claim which obviously China, Russia, even India, and so many other countries, South Africa later, refused to accept. And so that's the background. So, and of course, the use of the concept of a Cold War can be contested because certainly it doesn't cover everything that's going on in the world. For example, the conflict in the Middle East,
mm,
but and many others.
mm,
But it certainly does provide that larger context because a Cold War is not just any great power conflict. It's one conducted in the nuclear age. Hence, it's like a balloon. You squeeze it one part, it'll go to another, and hence it generates proxy wars. In the
mm,
first Cold War, Vietnam, well, all the way beginning from Korea to Vietnam and other plenty more. So, so that's where we are. But the worst thing is it was so avoidable. It was so avoidable. If only we didn't have the pretensions of the political West,
mm,
because but the worst thing is today it's going to be so much harder to end than the thing. As I said, perhaps it'll take a Trump just to say, look, we don't want to continue it. If NATO dissolves, the European Union is actually under threat as well, because the European Union has now been NATOized so intensely, it's moved from a welfare to a warfare project. So if the war in Ukraine ends with a substantive I mean, no one is a winner here, but with a
mm,
sort of a defeat of the greater ambitions of the West, then, it'll have a blowback effect. And that may put an end to this Cold War. But of course, as we know, in Washington, there's so many pushing for an extended period of conflict with China.
mm,
But
absolutely.
those are Cold War games, in other words.
And I guess the it might seem hard, but at least if ideas are driving this second Cold War, ideas are very changeable, much more changeable than some other things, perhaps. Did you want to just say a little bit more about how what people mean by a Cold War, or what particularly you mean by
Mm.
a Cold War? I mean, is it just a label of convenience? Does it have a real significance? What is it that is the distinctive characteristics of a Cold War that means that we're in a Cold War, a second
Yeah.
phase perhaps of a Cold War now?
Well, indeed, you could say that the First Cold War never ended, and therefore
Yes.
the Second Cold War. We did have those 25 odd years between 1989 and 2014,
Mm,
much talk of strategic partnerships, but it was a cold peace. None of the
mm,
fundamental questions of European and indeed global security had been resolved, and so we plunge into it. I think the Cold War is something very special. It's not just because it's great power politics in the nuclear age. It is that, but it's more substantive. It's a way you consider and view the protagonist, the adversary, the enemy, even, and it's a
mm,
way the enemy idea is constructed. So it isn't just to say, look, Moscow or Beijing or whatever have their own interests, which we don't like, but we can more or less accept them and negotiate on that basis. It's actually a far more existential view that the enemy is the character of the other, and that therefore a Cold War can only end when the other changes and becomes something else. So, for example, when China becomes, gives up communism and its state-led, statist developmental path, and indeed ultimately even gives up some of its neo-Confucian ideas about order, collectivism,
mm,
meritocracy, as opposed to liberal type democracy, so
mm,
on. So that's a much more profound conflict, at its crudest. And of course, the Biden administration was always crude. It would be autocracy versus democracy,
yes.
even though it was quite happy to get along with plenty of so-called autocracies if they were on their side. Hence, double standards is
mm,
absolutely a core part of it. I mean, it's systemic. It's not just
mm,
occasionally you act against what you say, but double standards in a Cold War is essential. It's also a way of thinking. It's hermetic, closed, in other words,
mm,
absolutely closed. That this is why dialogue and diplomacy in the Second Cold War are not working. In the First Cold War,
mm,
diplomacy continued. There were so-called superpower meetings. The last one UK attended was in Geneva in 1955. But then Khrushchev met with Eisenhower, met with successors, and so on. But this one, as I say, it's worse. It's more pernicious and more
mm,
profound than the First Cold War because the refusal, and certainly the Biden administration, to engage diplomatically with Russia substantively. It just didn't listen.
mm,
And Putin kept saying, Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, you didn't listen to us then, listen to us now. It's also, of course, the strategic arms issue, which, of course,
mm,
even in the first Cold War, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were strategic arms talks at various points. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1972, an absolute cornerstone, all gone. The only one left now is the New START, which is due to end in February 2026. So,
mm,
yeah, so Cold War. Just one final point about the Cold War, I mean, diplomacy, is that and I was going to say for us in England it's morning, but I was going to use the word gnostic. It's a
mm,
Gnostic war, which I know it's uh, meaning, in other words, that those on our side, and in fact possibly the other, Gnosticism is the belief that you have some sort of separate or secret or special access to the truth, to knowledge, to epistemology, what it's all about. And therefore, by definition, if we know it, then you guys don't. And until you understand our position, then but since you can't, then the only thing to do, and today this is to destroy you. And hence this
mm.
is why the European Union High Commissioner for Foreign Affairs, Kaja Kallas, is on record to say that Russia must be decolonized, i.e.
Yes,
broken up.
yes,
So I
yes.
mean, so it's a very profound and so the idea of a Cold War is an organizing envelope, I think, really.
Yeah,
So
yep,
that
yep.
within that framework, I'm very happy to understand and to listen to people who say, no, Cold War's misleading. Why?
Mm,
Because that was the first one. But if, bottom line, the Cold War is like a game of chess. The same
mm,
rules each time, but obviously different. It's played with different actors, different ideologies, and different moves
yep,
in
yep,
the
yep.
second time.
But you use it very much as a term of regret, whereas historians
Mm.
like, I don't know, Neil Ferguson, for example, use it as almost like a battle cry, I guess, for
Mm.
the next American
Yeah.
crusade.
It's a very good
But
word, by the way, crusade.
yeah, well,
Yeah.
the names of wars and historical periods change over time, don't they? I do wonder sometimes if the Cold War will one day be known as the American Crusades. But
Oh yeah, it's a big term. Yeah.
you did focus a lot there in describing the Cold War, not on interests and, brutal realities of politics a la John Mearsheimer, but more a lot of different ideas that shape the mindsets of decision makers and strategic thinkers. Is that why you really focused on the culture of the Second Cold War
Mm.
rather than the geopolitics or the geostrategy or the economics of Cold War Two?
Yeah. All of that is important. So when the history, like histories of the first Cold War, endless, fantastic books on the diplomatic history, the who met whom, where, when, what did they say? I love that, and so
Mm,
it's
mm,
very very important. But so in this, possibly, who knows what's going to be in the future? This is just the first cut, but it
mm,
also reflected my own personal shock, even not
mm,
surprise, but displeasure on the way that my engagement and the literally. the culture. And if you remember in the preface in the of that book, giving a talk in Nottingham, and the
Mm,
fact that colleagues of the person who invited me had the just a shocking audacity to censure him for inviting. We
mm,
had a very excellent open discussion on the Ukraine war. I
mm,
wasn't pushing anything. I can even accept that NATO enlargement in a different context would be beneficial. It stops
mm,
Greece and Turkey going to war,
mm,
that it actually does perhaps deliver public goods, but it had to be in the context of an overarching security arrangement with Moscow, and which would make Ukraine and all the other countries in between comfortable, secure.
mm,
So, but over and over again, I kept finding this sort of ostracism, this sort of not just normal academic critique, but this idea of this tone, this language. I mean, over the years, for example, 20 years, over and over again, if I chaired a conference or session, I remember one in Berlin, when Ukrainians, and in the early days, the Saakashvili years, a Georgian would get up and would speak to academics, to scholars who are engaged in normal discussion, as if we were total, well, I was going to say total idiots, but totally, as it were, in pain, hock to. I
mm.
mean, I've had emails. How much is
Sin-
Moscow paying you? How much is
mm.
Beijing paying you? Well, I say I'm waiting for the checks. Yes. Um, so it's, but that reduction of what should be normal debate, dialogue and debate to this reductionist Cold War trope, McCarthyite. And so that McCarthyite spirit of the 1950s pervading our discourse and culture. So that's what set me off on this
Mm,
particular, which was meant to be just a very short book on the, basically the lecture and the talk which we had in Nottingham, but it grew into it's still a relatively short book, but it's get to get it off my chest and it's culture, so therefore it's slightly more obviously anthropologists wouldn't
mm,
like it
mm.
because they've got a rather more distended version and good, quite right. So
I'm just a, I guess, amateur historian. I did do a PhD in history, but I was, long-term government official, and I certainly found it a very fascinating exploration of a whole series of questions that, um, I mean, I found the whole experience of the way in which, the world tried to cancel Russia, or the Western world tried to cancel Russia, and just the way people behaved so zealously and cruelly in that time was really, really quite something, and something that sort of I found your book really a helpful way of kind of trying to just think through some of the questions to ask about that experience. I guess, as you say, there'll be further attempts to explain it over time, but it was, an extraordinary cultural phenomenon, maybe not dissimilar to the way people got out on the streets in August 1914 and
absolutely.
cheered along their country to a very bloody disaster. Um,
But of course, they then actually had time to, as it were, remorse was at leisure,
yes,
and of course
yes,
that remorse of that war enthusiasm,
yes,
we're still, 100 years later, over 100 years later, we're
yeah,
still in the
yeah,
shadow of that First World War, and
yeah,
unfortunately, we're going to what is it called? Repent at leisure
yes,
over this
yes,
extraordinary cultural phenomenon. You're absolutely right. It is that
yeah,
war fever. And
yeah,
in Europe, I don't know what it's like in Australia, but in Europe, there is a genuine war fever. Our great leader, Keir Starmer, is becoming a war leader. He's,
yes,
all of these posing in like Zelensky, these sub-Churchillian posers. And, these are midgets, intellectually midgets, the statespeople. Macron's speech on the just a few days ago, the 5th of March, I think, an
yeah,
address to the people, nearly 15 minutes long, full of dishonesty and lies. But it was a war
yes,
speech, a rallying call to go over the top.
yeah,
Well, I mean, have we learnt nothing? Have we learnt
yes,
nothing?
yes,
Because
yes,
the First World War, the Second World War, never again. And of course, this is the foothills of the Third World War, because a Cold War,
yes,
by definition, is in the foothills of a war that you don't want to fight because of nuclear
yes,
weapons.
yes, yes. No, Australia's been really quite zealous. I mean, it's partly because the Murdoch press is very dominant in Australia, but also the public broadcasters have been very well. I've been told informally, sort of instructed to be very one-sided in their coverage of the war. But there was just an incident recently in the last couple of days where Australia said it would send, peacekeepers as part of the
Oh,
European
yes.
peacekeeping force.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
let's
uh,
find the peace before we get the peace.
yes, that's
Yeah.
right.
Mm.
And Russia said, well, in that case, you will be targets, kind of thing. And then you could just see the reaction of many of the Australian politicians and journalists, etc., who were very rah-rah for a while, but they were all going, you mean there's consequences for our, war fever?
Yeah.
It's really quite
And of course,
dreadful.
Australia in particular should be sensitive to this issue, having sent forces and made quite large losses in Vietnam.
Absolutely, absolutely. But yeah, the Australian response to the war has been quite distressing. Can we just talk, maybe tease out a little bit more some of the elements of the culture of the Cold War? I mean, you've mentioned a few of them in passing already, but and you've mentioned how in this war, in this second phase of the Cold War, Cold War Two, sort of radicalized by various ideas, and including the sort of Fukuyama faith in the end of history. But you also mentioned Straussianism, the
Mm.
sort of Leo Straussian sort of the secret knowledge of the powerful what advisors to the statesman sort of concept. Did you want to maybe just say a little bit more about some
Yeah.
of the key elements of this culture of the Second Cold War?
Yeah. Yes, indeed. This is why the Second Cold War, in some ways, is so far worse, so much worse than the first, is because that radicalization that took place, the political West established, or the West
Mm,
established, the Atlantic power system with its allies, Australia, New Zealand, etc. In the first Cold War, it perceives that it won that Cold War when but Gorbachev, by the way, never accepted that. He appealed to the charter system, to the
mm,
United Nations, rather than to say capitulation. So it was a vertical subordination,
mm,
abandoning Marxism-Leninism in favor of charter internationalism, sovereign internationalism, rather than to US hegemonic globalism. So that was the picture. So it gets worse because in the absence of the Soviet Union, you don't have a constraining force. China was still in the 90s in its quiet rise phase
mm,
and into until Xi Jinping effectively until 2013. So it radicalizes in, well, 6 or 7 ways. Just very briefly, the first way is it's Hegelianism. You mentioned that. So the vision that it was going to the march of history, the dialectic has now come to its conclusion. This is that there are no sustained alternatives to liberal democracy and so on. Fukuyama, of course, has repented of that view since then,
mm,
but it was always very primitive and crude. And
mm,
Hegelian dialectic
mm,
is always suspicious because even any dialectical view of history has this sort of deterministic element, rather
mm,
than my view, it's dialogical, is that it happens in
mm,
interaction. But certainly that Hegelian radicalization. The second one was the Kantian one, Immanuel Kant, the absolute use of human rights. It wasn't absolutely, it was a very narrow vision of what human rights consist
mm,
of. Because as far as I'm concerned, one of those elements has to be social welfare.
mm,
It doesn't have to be class-based, but just simply delivering public goods, and it has to be ensuring that people can live a dignified life. And of course, political rights are very important, but at the same time, the way that China, for example, has lifted millions out of poverty and into apartments and normal,
mm,
healthy life and dignified life where they can affirm themselves. That is a definition. So the radicalization of a very limited vision, and of course the view that only the Kantian view, perpetual peace, that a republican form of government is the most peaceful form, and
mm,
this has led on to regime change operations, orange revolutions, and so on, color revolutions. That's a second radicalization. The third one is the Hobbesian one, the continuation of militarism. It's absolutely extraordinary. There was a little dip in the 1990s, and then, by the time in 1994 that Clinton says NATO will enlarge, that sets in a dynamic of continued militarization of our continent, and of course the perpetuation of that alliance, that global alliance system. That's why I call it the political West or the global
mm,
West, because obviously it's not limited to the Atlantic Basin. So that militarism, and of course that continues with the bombing of Serbia, and we've seen all of that. And the NATO from never managed to change from being a collective defense body to a collective security, which is a slightly different concept
mm,
when it includes all. So security is bigger than simply defense, and it never had
mm,
that imaginative leap. The fourth way it has, so that would be the Hobbesian way. And then, of course, you have the economics of it, the Milton Friedman. I've always in two minds whether to call it Hayekian, because Hayek was a
mm,
more sophisticated thinker, but
mm,
Milton Friedman, in other words, that neoliberal. And
mm,
that is interesting intersection. The first 40 years after, we're talking about 40-year time spans after the end of the Second World War, was a social democratic movement. Welfare
mm,
statism, dirigism in France, state-led industrial policies, and so on. These last 40 years, accompanying precisely what we're talking about, the Second Cold War and its beginnings, the radicalization is the economic view, which was also went global. That against the states, dismantling welfareism, precarity, employment rights, of course, more
mm.
endless talk, but the actual
Yeah.
fact, the lived experience of massive workers is of instability, short-term contracts, and of course the statistics. Thomas Piketty shows it: growing inequality, the all of that inequality, which is dramatic and drastic, and of course the weakening of state capacity. What can the state do? And even the legitimacy of state action and deindustrialization. In the UK, it's I think 8% of British economy is
Mm,
industrial. So how on earth they can fight this war that they're going for with just no factories and so on to speak of. And indeed, you mentioned the Leo Strauss.
mm,
He's a fascinating concept because the Straussian vision is a very interesting one. It's ahistorical. Basically, the idea there are certain truths which are eternal from Plato onwards, and there can be no challenge. More than that, we have access to it, and you guys don't. The agnostic element, and more than that, we know we're right and you're wrong, so therefore they can't have dialogue. Straussians are famous in not engaging in
mm,
dialogue. They
mm.
can't do it because it's the keepers of the eternal flame of a secretly revealed truth, and
Yeah.
that's what Washington Beltway establishments as the Atlantic Council, that vast Cold War apparatus. So that self-righteousness, that sort
Mm,
of ahistorical approach. Just one final thing, which I slightly modified my earlier list, is that there is this. You could add a Milan Kundera approach to it. Now,
okay.
Milan Kundera argued in a famous essay in 1984 that the Eastern European countries had been somehow hijacked by the Soviet Union from their true destiny in the West. So this ideology of Europeanism,
Mm,
uh, basically a very peculiar version, because Europe has been very much the dark continent, as Mark Mazur has said. We started the First World War, we got the Second World War, and we seem to be very keen on starting a third one now. In other words, it's had this crusader mentality you've mentioned before, this liberal civilizationism, which of course, uh, uh, and now for the East Europeans, they, after the end of the Cold War, adopted a very peculiar position, that as it were, that they were the holders also of in a Straussian sense of a
mm,
secret knowledge, that we know just how bad the Soviet Union was,
mm,
And you guys in the West have got illusions that Moscow can change. It's not.
mm,
It's evil. It's awful. It's barbaric. It's uncivilized. And that we have this thing, and it's our job to teach you in Western Europe. So we've had remember old and new Europe of the Iraq war times. And so this new Europe says that we're actually the genuine one, and that
mm,
you Germans who have built this Nord Stream gas pipeline to Russia, that you simply can never trust it. It's a condition of absolutely existential war against these Mongol hordes and barbarians. And of course, this is why they've demonized and dehumanized those people in the Donbass and Donetsk and
mm,
Lugansk as Sovoks, as backward,
mm.
as barbarians, and therefore we can bomb them and shoot them and make them suffer because they'll live in caves and we'll go to school, as Zelensky famously put it. So
Yeah,
monstrous language. But
yeah.
the fact is that after the end of the Cold War, we failed to ensure that the Eastern European countries and their populations are genuinely engaged in peace and reconciliation. And they have genuine grievances. This is not for a second.
Mm,
My father was nearly one of those taken at Katyn.
mm, mm,
He met the Soviet forces as a Polish army reservist in
mm,
September 27, no, sorry, 20, in the 17th of September
mm,
1939. So I don't know the reality, but of course that's the whole point, is to overcome that. So
mm,
that's about, not just to constantly feed that grievance into the West European polity, which they have now done.
mm,
Hence the demonization of Russia way beyond. Of course, we can have our criticisms, and we should have that. But
mm,
as all countries, but there's intensity. You talked about cancellation. This is
mm,
something absolutely new. For example, the banning of direct flights. Now,
mm,
banning of direct flights, is that going to say so a babushka, a grandmother, cannot see her grandchild, of human contact? It never even happened. No one even thought of such a thing in the first Cold War. And it's those East Europeans. There is no limit. They will destroy themselves. Ukraine has destroyed itself. And
mm,
they will, if they're given half a chance, will destroy Western Europe as well. And so,
mm.
my advice to the Australians, not that you're going to let anybody wants it, but I'll give it anyway, is of course keep out of it. This is not this is a war of the global north, and
Mm.
Australia has got a better destiny for its people, and it's a marvelous country to focus on its development and not get embroiled in a war like Vietnam, in which it does not need to do so.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Unfortunately, our governing elites across the entire, almost the entire political spectrum, are very keen to get involved, and in part, I think, because there is sort of like emigre politics in Australia, as there is in
Yes.
America as well, but also Australia has this dynamic of wanting to be the sort of teacher's pet in the empire, so to speak, and the we've been a teacher's pet, I guess, for decades.
I thought we were that in England, the United Kingdom, one
Uh,
special relationship. We want to be, and we're fighting for you. We'll fight you for the position of
Yes,
teacher's
well,
pet.
at least we're young enough as a country to still be called a teacher's pet, whereas I don't know if Britain can still call
Pretend
itself
to
a
be something
student.
else. Yeah.
Um, and you also have a whole chapter in the culture of the Second Cold War about how this Cold War is more dangerous. And do
Mm.
you want to maybe just bring out some of those points?
Yeah. Oh, it's far more dangerous that after the Cuban Missile Crisis, at least once the dangers of nuclear war were there. First of all, there was that whole architecture of strategic arms control, and when the United States abrogated unilaterally the ABM, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, in June 2002, that opened up a whole area of dismantling that. But more than that, it's the attitudes. It's this extremism, this recklessness, which of
Mm,
course is particularly apparent in the United Kingdom, in London. There has been always this sort of Boris Johnson type of excess, bombast, bluster, and belligerence is what characterize our policies. Again, as in Australia, across the political spectrum, the Conservatives and this Labour government is as militaristic and as intolerant as anything which has preceded it. And it's dangerous because, above all, as so many commentators say, is that the Western ruling elites have lost their sense of danger. They've lost their sense of measure, and that human life is precious and precarious, and their willingness to trade militarism and their hatred for Moscow or Beijing or whatever, their own destiny, their own populations to be sacrificed as so very much like what you mentioned 1914. It really is that sort of atmosphere. I need to pull the blind down.
Yep.
We don't often get the sun, but it's just starting to pop out.
Ah, yes, I'm
Yeah.
surprised to see it in Britain.
Yes, indeed. Well, as I joke, I got up late this morning and therefore missed the summer because the sun. Yeah, that war fever, and we are,
Mm,
people and commentators, politicians, the mass media, Daily Mail say we've got to prepare for war with Russia in 4 years' time. Now, how can you even begin to contemplate against the world's largest nuclear power?
mm,
It's got over 1,500 deployed missiles, 5,000 over 5,000 in reserve. And, with hypersonic missiles and the whole panoply of this, well, even the idea of it immediately should have got a. And also, what makes it worse, possibly this time, is the absence of massive anti-war movements, peace movements. The
mm,
churches are remarkably quiet this time. I mean, the World Council of Churches, I've not heard anything from them for a long, long time.
mm,
So it's also the passivity of populations, in part pacified by what you've alluded to it earlier, the mass media. And that's why it's so important, these alternative forms of engagement in the public sphere. I mean, your blog and
mm.
others is so important, and that's why I agree to participate in them because we're not getting a look in. And even the left has effectively collapsed. I mean, your government, the Labour, a so-called
Mm.
Labour government, Albanese, still committed to AUKUS, which is one of the most crazy ideas, it seems to me. You're going to pay over 300 billion dollars, pounds, for something that you may or may not get in
Yeah,
many decades to come.
yeah,
And so, plus, of course, the de facto soft nuclearization, what should be a nuclear-free zone, and
yeah,
so many other
absolutely.
issues. Um, so, uh, so this sense of danger, and this is why a fellow called Sergei Karaganov, you may have heard of him, Russian
Hmm.
commentator, saying that Russia ought to lob a nuclear missile somewhere towards the west, possibly Poland. Almost certainly, he's got England, United Kingdom in mind as the most pugnacious and reckless state in the West. Just to give them a warning, that you're playing with fire.
Mm,
And but of course, it's dreadful thinking. Even the idea of it is appalling,
mm,
appalling. Unspeakable. But the fact that this is in the public debate, so that's why I say it's so much more dangerous. And the attitudes, and the fact that Russia's the demonization of Russia. I've been 3 to 4 times since the war's begun. I believe in dialogue. I believe in engagement. And the feeling in Russia is, Russia, nearly 150 million people. They are Europeans, if I can use
mm,
that term,
mm,
in the sense of culture, of
mm,
lifestyles, the consumption patterns, reading habits, educational system, and all of that. And yet somehow or other, there have been, the personalization on this figure of Putin, who actually, in the Russian context, is a moderate. He's being pushed by war hawks, as we all are, but he's been holding them back. I mean, in all sorts of ways, actually. They're saying, why are you fighting this war in Ukraine with one hand tied behind our back?
mm,
Why don't we really get serious? Which, awful again talk. But there's also, above all, a very large sentiment. Business wants to stop the war. And a recent poll, Levada, has shown 70% of the population want peace.
mm,
There's not that war enthusiasm in Russia. Well,
mm,
surprisingly enough, it's not
mm.
there. It's more militaristic in the West than it is in
Yeah,
Russia,
yeah,
surprisingly
yeah.
enough.
I just wanted to ask you one last question about how viewers or citizens might sort of protect themselves, I guess, against some of the more negative aspects of this culture of the Second Cold War. But before I ask you that question, did you want to just comment on, I guess, the situation in Ukraine and I guess how you see this sort of ending? I mean, my overall feeling is it's such a horrible, tragic ruin of a country, and it's so sad. And hopefully the war will come to an end soon. But I guess uh, there may well be enormous problems for Ukrainians, social and other sort of problems for Ukrainians in the months and years ahead, quite apart from the conflict. What's your overall feeling of what the impact of this war on Ukraine has been? Because often people, you know, pigeonhole people into corners saying they stand with Russia or stand with Ukraine. But what's your personal sort of response to seeing what's happened in Ukraine over the last few years?
Yeah, absolutely devastating, an absolute tragedy. Nikolai Petrov's got a book called The Tragedy of Ukraine, which is one of the best books on the subject because it avoids precisely that sort of angle of pro this or that. It's a
Mm,
very humane and
mm,
marvelous book. And of course, as we move towards, I'm arguing it's the end of the beginning, and
mm,
I just hope we can get to the beginning of the end. But Trump
mm,
has started the end of the beginning. He's put an end to the, intensification of conflict. Of course, Europeans now want to own this war and Europeanize the war, so that may
mm,
well continue. But what is absolutely clear is that whatever happens, any sort of semi-peace, that it can't just be a ceasefire, an
mm,
armistice, which would lead to the Korean situation now, how many
mm,
years since the Korean armistice of 1953, with an armed conflict in the heart of Europe, which would then entrench the Cold War, entrench an Iron Curtain. No, so that can't be allowed. And Moscow has it absolutely clear, no European so-called peacekeepers, but, and it has to be some sort of United Nations monitored framework.
mm,
That's the first instance. But to your larger question, the ending of this war, which would also address that, has to be at four levels. And the first and fundamental one is peace and reconciliation within Ukraine itself. And that
mm,
was the whole point of Minsk, of course, the Minsk agreements, which were that the Donbass would return to Ukrainian sovereignty, but with devolution and cultural and linguistic autonomy. And one way or another, this war is generally it's a civil war, and it needs to deal with that as well. The West
mm,
refuses to accept this term, but it was. We know
mm,
this. And therefore, again, one of those levels of dishonesty in so much Western discourse. But that's the first level. The second one, surprisingly enough, is that there has to be reconciliation between Moscow and Kiev and Lvov and
mm,
so on. So that second level, and the point is that Russia and Ukraine have been entwined for 1,000 years. Ukrainian nationalists hate to even have that stated and said, no, no, we were something totally different. It's insane. It's a
mm,
total travesty of history. That's not to deny the distinctive Ukrainian identity, now
mm,
language and culture, and its own traditions, which I love actually in all sorts of ways. So that's not to deny that, but it's to
mm,
say they were entwined, and it's
mm,
entwined with 20% of of Ukrainian population earlier were ethnically Russian, 30% at least using Russian, and maybe 60% Russian as many, including Zelensky himself, of
mm,
course. And so that second level of reconciliation, which the West has absolutely hated, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and for 30 years since the end of the First Cold War, they have poisoned and worked assiduously. The US Embassy in Kiev has done absolutely everything for 40 years to poison relations between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, can
mm,
you believe it?
mm,
That they, want never said Brzezinski, if Russia and Ukraine get together, then Russia becomes an empire. It was infantile, vicious talk, and something which I've condemned for
mm,
decades.
mm,
And of course, it was a feeding in that. So that's a
mm,
second level of, and it's not impossible. How
mm,
many? So many of my colleagues, for example, I'll just give you one example. I won't give names, but my good friend, professor in St. Petersburg, he has a sister who lives in Kiev, and he has two brothers who live in the Donbass. And you know, these are entwined,
mm,
and that has, and we have to now ignore the Anglo-American uh, endlessly poisoning this relationship, and to restore that. It'll take a long, it's hard work. But of
mm,
course, the fact that France and Germany are now the best of friends shows after all these endless wars, it can be done. It should have been done earlier. The
yep,
third level is a pan-European level of a peace order. We finally need to have this Lisbon to Vladivostok dimension, that we need to stop this East Europeanization of poisoning, of endless war, which will end in a nuclear war if it continues. Say, no, we must stop that, and we must build a security order. It doesn't mean dismantling NATO, essentially, but they're now talking of a European NATO, a European treaty organization, an ETO. So they can't stop. As you know, looking from Australia, you'd see this the northern the northern countries, the West seems to be obsessed with war, and certainly the global South sees that. You know, you
mm,
started the First World War, the Second World War. Now
mm,
you want the third. We want nothing to do with it.
mm,
So Europeans finally have to get rid of their skeletons, their dark shadow. And the fourth element, of course, is where we're beginning, is the superpower relationship, Moscow and Washington.
mm,
And and that's why I very much welcome Trump's engagement with Moscow, not at the expense of anyone, but for the benefit of everyone,
mm,
to start this dialogue. So,
mm,
and of course, like a Rubik cube, all four dimensions have to line up. It's going to be very hard. But if you know the task, and like a Rubik's cube, then it's achievable. And if you don't know
mm.
what you want to do, you're never going to do it.
Absolutely. And what about a single piece of advice to, all this discussion about high diplomacy and all that sort of
Mm.
stuff. Most people don't get anywhere near such conversations in their life. And yet, this second Cold War has in a way conscripted us all through the media, etc., into a culture war. What would be your advice to viewers? And I know there are viewers to this channel from in Russia and Ukraine, all around the world, just about how to protect yourself from the sort of hateful culture of the Second Cold War.
It's a marvelous question, and you're absolutely right that I suppose the change begins with ourselves, and the way that would be is against this sort of dialectical view of inevitable march of history of Western power, of civilization, liberal civilization, and so on, civilizing mission and crusades.
Mm,
That and it's dialogue. That's my big thing.
mm,
Political dialogism, and the model for that, of course, is the term comes from the Bakhtin study of Dostoevsky, and Dostoevsky, my great novelist, and in Dostoevsky's example, well, the brothers Karamazov, where the protagonists talk, and then they talk a bit more, and they talk yet more, and 100 pages long, they're still talking. But at the end of it, everyone changes. So
mm,
dialogism isn't simply me convincing you. It's actually by engaging with you, we both change. So I'm
mm,
not your teacher, master, vice versa, but that we learn together. And that is on an individual level, but also on the national level. So we can learn much from China. We can learn much from South Korea. It's the way it works, it's Neo-Confucian ideas, but also we can learn lessons of how not to do things, of this absolute obsession, the way that higher education, for example, in which I'm deeply involved, has
mm,
become so instrumental. It's become so
mm,
that knowledge is a portion, a dish to be dished out, rather than something which is to be savored and learnt, and
mm,
making us changing at the end. And so at all levels, dialogue, dialogism, and a permanent openness to change and to the views of others at a national and personal level.
what a wonderful surprise to end the interview with, Richard. I've got a copy of Bakhtin's book somewhere
Oh,
there on the
oh, lovely.
overstocked bookshelf, and I think that's such a wonderful thought. Thank you so much for all your insights and your wisdom. Thank you very much, Richard Sakwa.
Been my pleasure. It's been a great talk. Thank you.